All right, guys. So what I wanted to talk about during today's meeting was, first off, the idea of writing a literature review to set you up for a section of your research paper that you'll be submitting in about a week and a half, I believe. We'll cover all of that, but this is something that's new to the paper that you guys didn't include in your paper for 293 if you did take 293 with me. Since 294 has a lot more of a writing focus, um, there is a introduction section to this paper that's going to be really important. And the introduction is specifically going to be centered around this idea of a literature review. So definitely writing a literature review is something that not everyone has experience with reviewing scientific literature. So I definitely want to make sure to walk you guys through what exactly a literature review is and what you should expect to include in this section of your paper. So goals for today, if you plan to spend any work time today doing your literature review, which I definitely encourage you to do, it's going to be definitely wise for you to set aside some work time just to find sources for your literature review. I would also recommend creating an outline before you write. I know this is the kind of advice people get about writing all the time, and I know it's really tempting to skip this step and just go right into writing sort of blind and without a plan. But at a minimum, if you've found some sources, you can create a really rough outline for how you're going to cobble those things together. I encourage you to take these steps before you even begin sitting down and opening up a new document and beginning to write, because trying to find your background sources for a literature review at the same time leads to a whole host of poor writing outcomes. Your writing will be worse off if you go in not just without a plan, but without the sources that you know you're going to be writing about. Your writing will end up a lot more aimless and less organized. It's a lot easier to plagiarize because you'll simultaneously have your sources open, and it'll be a lot more tempting to copy language wholesale. I'm going to talk more about academic integrity, namely proper paraphrasing technique, tomorrow, but you really, really want to develop these skills of putting things into your own words and making sure that you're not either consciously or inadvertently plagiarizing, because then you will not gain credit for any of the writing that you do, and it causes some pretty adverse outcomes for your ability to succeed in the class. So having your source materials open when you're writing, it's just so tempting to sort of pick from the language that you're reading and put it into your own document, and that is definitely something you want to avoid. And it's not any easier either. It actually, I think, ends up taking more time and again leads to poorer outcomes. If you're sort of trying to cobble together your writing while not even having your background sources first, again, like I mentioned, you don't even know what you're writing if you don't have your background sources yet. So the task is actually a lot harder. You're not going to save time. It's not going to be easier. Do yourself the favor of doing your writing in steps. So finding sources, then creating an outline, and then sitting and writing. So I would advise for most of you, unless you plan to sort of spend all day working on this literature review, you don't even need to start writing today. Really, you need to focus on collecting your background sources first. So before I get into strategies and guidance on writing your literature review, I do want to cover a few key pieces of information that you need to know about collaborating with your group mates in the context of a literature review. Sharing sources that you find with your group members, if you choose to do so, is perfectly appropriate. Group members can have the same sources that you cite in your paper. It is not plagiarism for two people to cite the same source. So if you feel like working collaboratively with your group mates to find more sources and pool those efforts between you, absolutely you can do that. It is not plagiarism to share sources with your group members. So in the finding sources stage, it is completely appropriate to sort of put your heads together and work collaboratively. Because again, if you're working together and one person is off finding some sources and a second person is off doing the same, once you pool your efforts, you'll have more sources between you. So if you do want to work together with your group mates, that is perfectly fine. It is not a violation of academic integrity in the context of this particular assignment. What you don't want to do is pool your efforts at the writing stage. The manuscript that you guys are creating for this class is not a collaborative effort. Do not write together with your group mates. Do not write a single paper. I do not want to see that. You are all writing your paper individually. If the papers between group mates sound similar because you're talking about the same project, that's fine. But I will be able to tell if you have sat down and written together. You do not want to have the language in your paper be the same as your group mates. So do not, once you reach the writing stage, work together with your group mates. It is in fact plagiarism to copy writing from a group member. Even if you were writing together and you do consider it a collaborative effort, if there is identical language between two group mates' separate papers, you have technically committed an act of plagiarism. So do not write collaboratively and do not share written language between one another. So sharing sources together, fine. Writing together, no go. All right, so now I want to delve into this idea of finding sources for your literature review. So I'm going to walk through what sources you need to have at a minimum in your literature review, and we're going to walk through the different sections. And again, I'm going to walk through some guidance for writing this section of the paper, and I'm going to end by showing you guys the instructions document that is now available on Canvas, but I'll walk through it so that we've all sort of taken a look at it together. So to begin your literature review, the literature is essentially a section from the introduction of your paper. So the introduction does what it sounds like. It introduces the topic at hand. So in order to do that, you do want to broadly identify your area of interest at the very beginning. An introduction to the paper needs to start kind of broad. The literature review is going to be a specific subsection of your introduction where you review, synthesize, and summarize a body of literature. Some people think that a literature review means that you choose a single external source and you summarize that single source. That is not what we're talking. It's about reviewing at least a handful of sources on a similar topic. So my guidelines for what sources you need to have start with at least one non-academic citation. Something that sort of kicks off the paper in a way that's meant to draw the reader in. There's lots of different options for how to do this, but finding any citation relevant to your topic from mainstream publications, from government research, all of that is fair game. So you're going to want to have at least one, and this should be included in the very beginning of your paper. Then the next section of your literature review should be one paragraph at least devoted to defining your independent variable. So you're going to want to name and describe your independent variable with a conceptual definition, and then you're going to want to review or synthesize or summarize at least 2 to 3 sources relevant to the topic of that IV. So if, let's say, your independent variable that you'll be manipulating in your experiment is self-esteem, have at least one standalone paragraph dedicated to explaining what self-esteem is and reviewing some background literature that tells us a little bit about self-esteem to further supplement your definition of self-esteem, to discuss what we know self-esteem is associated with, why self-esteem is important, why it's a topic we care about. So at least 2 to 3 to that IV itself. You can obviously have more than one paragraph devoted to your IV, but you need to have at least one, and that section on your IV needs to contain at least 2 to 3 academic sources. So you guys now know how to find academic sources using PsycInfo. I'll briefly review that in a second, but if you went through the finding and reading research section or worksheet, you guys should be an expert at being able to find academic sources. You're going to want to have a corresponding section for your dependent variable. So if your dependent variable is happiness, you're going to want to devote at least one paragraph to identifying your dependent variable, defining it, and citing at least 2 to 3 academic sources that further go into that topic of your DV. So further defining the topic, explaining what other variables are associated with it, why that variable is important. And then you're going to want to have at least one paragraph, it's the end of the literature review, where you explain why you think your IV may be related to your DV. You're going to want to cite at least one source that backs up your claim. So this is going to be a source that specifically talks about your IV and your DV simultaneously. And this will be your evidence to set up your claim for why you think the IV and the DV are associated, and back up your claim that you think they're likely linked together. So in terms of this academic versus non-academic source distinction, again, if you went through my finding sources lecture materials, you should have some working background on that topic, but I found this nifty source from a university's library webpage that really gets into the distinction, as well as this handy flowchart that helps you identify whether a source is academic or not. Pro tip, if you found it on PsycInfo, it's academic. If you found it elsewhere on the internet, it might be academic, it might not be. So when you're looking for your academic sources, I do highly recommend using PsycInfo as the way you do that. What constitutes non-academic sources, and I got this from the same university library website, anything from a newspaper or magazine, a web page or blog entry, or any popular book, meaning a book that does not have in-text citations. So examples of specific sources that I would recommend you maybe look into. If you're going mainstream publication, you might be going for a newspaper, something like the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press, the New York Times. All of those are fair game. A government website, specifically any government source that has research, so the National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, or the census. You should be able to find a wealth of information on any of your topics on any of those governmental websites, so that's a great option. Or you could go pop psychology sources. So Psychology Today is a really great online periodical that has these really easy to read and digest articles on topics. So if you find a Psych Today article, those are typically written by PhDs, but they're not necessarily a strictly peer-reviewed source, but they sort of skirt the line of being slightly academic since they're always written by experts and they tend to have really good citations. But that would be a good option for your non-academic source. Or a website like Popular Science, again, you get a lot of articles written for mainstream audiences on scientific topics. If you're going your academic source or your non-academic source, the idea is how are you going to incorporate that into your introduction section? So here I just have a screenshot from an article that accomplishes the inclusion of a non-academic source as a great way to introduce a topic by, for example, the inclusion of a really eye-catching statistic. So for example, this particular article on ADHD, depression, and substance abuse among college students, very early on in the paper, they include this statistic. So up to 50% of college students report binge drinking, directly resulting in these increased risks. So this is a great statistic because it frames the sort of importance of this topic by indicating a statistic related to how often college students engage in that binge drinking behavior. So it frames the issue as important and relevant. And if you look at the actual citation for this particular statistic, the authors derived it from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, which I believe is a subset of the National Institute of Health. So this is a great example of how you could shoehorn in a non-academic source, just anything that frames the issue, makes it seem interesting. It's meant to sort of draw in the reader and make them a little bit interested in your topic. So in terms of academic sources, again, I'm not going to go into this too in depth because I've gone over this information with you guys. You're well familiar with how to use PsycInfo. And additionally, we've covered how you could use Google Scholar to find academic sources. It's likely going to yield a much larger hit range than PsycInfo. So although you can use Google Scholar, I'm going to recommend you use PsycInfo for the most part. And then ResearchGate, sometimes if there's an article that you can't find the full text of, through PsycInfo, you might be able to find that the author has posted it to their ResearchGate. So it doesn't hurt to check out ResearchGate as well. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the content and how you should approach actually putting together this literature review. Again, I've got an example here of a paper that breaks down their literature review much as I'm envisioning or hoping that you guys will be able to. So I'm going to walk through the sections of this particular nostalgia paper to explain how these different sections of the literature review should come together. So first off, you do need to include an abstract in this particular manuscript that you'll be writing for 294. So your abstract, it's technically a separate section from the introduction. It's technically a section in and of itself, and it's a standalone one-paragraph overview of the entire paper. So when you're writing your manuscript, you can put this on its own separate page entirely. This one paragraph should essentially have an overview of every single section of the paper. So a good abstract would typically have a sentence or so introducing the topic, a sentence or two talking about the actual methods, a sentence or two on the results, and a sentence or two on the discussion. And when we're talking short. I've had abstract maximum word counts that were 100 words. For your guys' purposes, the 150 target is likely what you're going to want to hit. So then the introduction begins typically with a single, very, very broad opening to the paper. So this is when you, as broadly as possible, broach the general topic of the paper. You'll see a major heading of introduction, and then the first paragraph is meant to, again, grab the reader's attention and generally introduce the topic at hand. If we're talking a scientific manuscript, we're going to start broad in the introduction and you get more specific in the methods and results. So here you're going to start very generally by talking about sort of what is the main gist of your study. This would be a great place to include your non-academic source, because your academic source, the goal of it should hopefully be something that hooks the reader's attention and generally introduces the topic. So then onto the literature review subsections. You'll notice in this particular paper, given that it's a nostalgia paper, that nostalgia has its own dedicated section where that independent variable has its own heading underneath the introduction major heading. In this section, the IV is introduced, or its conceptual definition is included. You don't need to use a dictionary to get the conceptual definition of your independent variable. I would recommend probably getting your conceptual definition from an academic source, but most critically in this section, you see that there's a review of relevant literature. And again, this is not a single paper that you find and that you review. There's at least a few. So for your paper, in this first section where you discuss your IV, you're going to need, again, at least 2, hopefully more, shoot for 3 external sources, academic sources that you cite. The goal of this section is to acquaint the reader with the topic of nostalgia and give the reader an idea of what we already know about this topic. That's the purpose of a literature review, to expose the reader to what we already know about the topic to set up the novel experiment that you have conducted. So this is going to be where you cite and review at least a handful of sources. And you're going to want to do the same thing for the DV, a separate section where you identify, define, and review relevant literature on your dependent variable. The end of the introduction should set the reader up for what the current research is about. So by the end of the introduction, you're sort of honing in on the present research and using the review of the existing literature as sort of a justification for why the current research matters and why you're doing it. So you're going to want to set up your justification for the current research, why it's important, and briefly describe what the current research is. So in this section, you want to state the aim or goal of the present research and briefly state your research question, maybe a couple details about the design, and your predictions or hypotheses. So these are the major sections that should go into your literature review. Now, if you're planning to complete an outline for your literature review, which again, I highly recommend, I would recommend you begin by just collating some sources. Use the note-taking template from the Finding and Reading Research worksheet. You know, I'm a huge fan of that template for organizing your notes and your thoughts. And just start putting together a list of what sources you might use. Try to find more than 3 sources in this process, because you don't just want to find the first 2 sources and say, screw it, I'm done, that's the minimum. Try and find more so that you have some choices to go through. If you're trying to find more resources, consult the references section of any single source that you find, because that will obviously be further relevant information. So use those references section to augment your ability to find resources. My recommendation for once you have your resources, you don't have to read every source that you collect from start to finish. You might be thinking, holy crap, how am I going to read all of these scientific papers, there's no time. Trust me when I say even the experts will not necessarily read the sources that they cite from start to finish, but you will definitely want to read at a minimum the abstract, for sure, at least read the abstract for any paper you choose to review. And ideally eyeball the discussion section as well. That's going to be really useful for helping you understand the purpose of whatever paper it is you choose to review. The introduction section of any source you find is going to be great for getting more background information, possibly finding more sources. But to review a piece of literature in your own introduction section, you should at least have a passing familiarity for what the paper you're including is about. So definitely look at the abstract, definitely eyeball the discussion, and any further reading you do is just the extra icing on top of the cake. Make sure you have at least enough understanding of the source to be able to cite it confidently. So in terms of figuring out how you're going to include the sources, how you're going to organize them. Be thinking about what your source is good for, whether any particular article you find gives you a good operational definition for your construct, or whether it's maybe a paper that gleans light on any outcomes associated with the variable in question. So to use the same example of like self-esteem, what do we know about self-esteem? What is it good for? Why is it important? Those are all great things to include in your literature review. Okay, so now briefly before we shift gears and talk quickly about Qualtrics, I'll point your attention to this instructions document. So I always like to make sure you guys have a really good, solid understanding of what I'm looking for in any of these written assignments. So all of the details about when this draft is due, basic details about formatting, as well as my general guidelines, sort of tips that I have for helping you approach this assignment, as well as the specific sections that should go into this draft and what all you should expect to include in those various sections. So make sure that you're reading the instructions carefully before you start this journey of trying to write your introduction and literature review. So at this point, I'll take any questions if you have them, and then I'm just going to briefly direct your guys' attention to a couple of things about Qualtrics. But do any of you here have any questions about the literature review before I slightly shift gears? If you'd like to hold your question until I'm done recording, that's fine as well. Okay, so if that's the case, I'm just going to briefly direct your attention to my Qualtrics sample survey. So again, the vast majority of you were in my 293, so you all basically have a good, solid working understanding of how to program in Qualtrics. Definitely feel free to review those materials, those general materials on programming Qualtrics if you feel like you have any questions. If you have not programmed in Qualtrics before, definitely make sure to check those materials out and try and get a handle on how generally to approach programming Qualtrics. So the basics, like how to create blocks, how to create questions, creating a consent and a debrief form, all of that's very important. Previewing your survey, all of that general stuff. For those of you who did have your correlational survey programmed in Qualtrics in 293, you basically have most of the knowledge and experience you need to program your experiments, right? Consent is going to be the same. The language is a little bit different here. The programming of your DVs is going to be the same. It's going to be scale format if you want to have your questions all separate, if you want to use a matrix format. All of those things are, again, up to you. So you know how to program scales in Qualtrics, demographic, section, debrief, etc. The main difference here is the fact that you now have an experiment. So this here is the real major distinction between what you guys did in your 293 survey and what you're going to need to do in your experiment. So as you can see here, I've programmed in the conditions from the survey materials template. So in order to program my manipulation, which was 2 conditions where participants were directed to reflect on a memory and then spend a couple minutes writing about it. On a single block, I programmed both conditions. I created a text entry type question The text of the prompt should go here in the question text, and then text entry will just give participants a text box within to write. So this is my nostalgia condition. This is my control condition, where people are just going to think about and write about an ordinary memory. So at this point, both of these conditions are in the same block, meaning that until I create random assignment, participants would see both this prompt and this prompt, but that's not what I want. I want participants to randomly be assigned to either this one or this one. So you see this box here that says that the question has been randomized. Qualtrics has changed its functions and upgraded throughout the years, so I actually had to go back in and figure out how to do this morning, because they changed it from how random assignment was done years back when I was in grad school. But the option to create random assignment should look like this. So you're going to have both your prompts together as separate questions in the same block, and you're going to go up to block options, and you're going to indicate question randomization. Initially, no randomization will be selected, meaning that participants would see everything, but we only want them to see one of the following questions within the block. So adding this question randomizer on this block is going to make it so that participants will only see one of the conditions, so present only one of the total questions. What this accomplishes, and I'll show you in preview, is that participants will be randomly assigned to either the nostalgia or the experimental control. So if we make it past the consent form and the instructions, see that this preview participant has been assigned to only contemplate an ordinary life memory. After they do that, they're straight on to the DV. If we restart the survey, let's see where we get randomly assigned from there. You're definitely going to want to preview this and make sure that participants are only being assigned to one condition. Okay, it has me back in the ordinary memory condition because it just does it randomly. And then you can see that this hypothetical third participant will be in the nostalgia group. And again, they will only see that condition, and then they will move on to the DV. This means that half of your participants will be in the experimental group, half will be in the control group. Qualtrics should evenly randomly assign. As you saw, it assigned me to ordinary memory in the first preview, ordinary memory again in the second, and experimental in the third. So Qualtrics is randomly assigning out of the two conditions on each participant taking the survey. So technically, it might end up that you have more participants in one condition or the other just because of a random fluke. We're definitely going to want to keep an eye on that. And if there's unequal assignment for whatever reason, Qualtrics screwed up its algorithm, we can cross that bridge when we come to it. But this randomizer should keep the groups pretty equal. So I've shared the sample survey with everyone who had a Qualtrics account, which was basically everyone in the class, barring a couple people who are not in my 293, but you should have access to that sample survey. Definitely check it out. What you guys are going to want to accomplish today is to just create your Qualtrics survey. So just make a new survey, give it a title, and share it with me as a collaborator. Bring my screen back up to make sure you guys know how to do that. And this is the kind of thing where it's definitely going to make everyone's life easier, to make sure that both me and any group members you have are all added as total collaborators. So this is going to be in the tools drop-down menu, collaborate. You'll be able to find me or anyone in your group. Once you find people in this search function, you're going to need to hit add, and you're going to need to hit save. If you neglect to hit add or save, it will not actually add me or any of your group mates. But as you guys can see, I added everyone in the class to the survey, and I gave you the ability to copy anything from the sample survey. So that's just in case you want to copy anything that I've created to make your life a little bit easier. So again, at this point, does anyone have any questions on Qualtrics? All right, I'm going to stop the recording there, and then I'm just going to hang out until everyone has left the Zoom in case anyone has any questions.